Water, water everywhere, and the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. Very noisy in here tonight. Lots of background noise. I'm sorry about that. The introduction on this video is very long, so go ahead and hit the chapters if you want to skip to the good bits. For those remaining, let's get weird. My pattern of alcoholism is confusing and frustrating. I'm as likely to relapse over good news as I am to relapse over bad news. The urge to blow things up when I'm happy is as powerful as the urge to drink my sorrows when I'm depressed. And I know I'm not alone in that. We will always find a justification to drink. Good news? Celebrate it with a drink. Bad news? Commiserate it with a drink. And it's confusing and contradictory stuff like that which makes alcohol so hard to beat. When things are bad, I cheer myself up by remembering when times were good. And when times are good, as they are right now in my life, I have to sometimes force myself to remember when things were bad. Because it doesn't matter how many days or weeks or months or years of sobriety I have. The next relapse is always only seconds away. It's hard to live like that, to always be on guard, always be vigilant. But I have no choice. If there is a choice for me, it's a choice between constant, exhausting internal vigilance or a horrible, slow, lonely death. But that's alcoholism, isn't it? We can't kid ourselves that our lives will be perfect once we're in recovery, once we've left the alcohol behind. That dark passenger will always be sat right beside us, always reaching for the wheel. We play that dealt, and that's how I live, day to day, one moment at a time, one decision not to drink at a time. And my shields are always up. Part of that vigilance involves forcing myself to remember just how bad it got, how lonely it was. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to remember together how bad it was. We're going to talk specifically about the intersection between loneliness and alcoholism. So, brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bat Country. Okay, so first, a quick bit of context and an introduction, since I know very few people watch these videos in order. As weird as I feel doing it, I do feel like I need to introduce myself better at the start of my videos. So, about me. My name is Bat Country. I'm currently 39 and I make very laid back, but sometimes quite intense sobriety content that you can fall asleep to. That is my niche. If you dig this kind of vibe, then please do subscribe so that I know. Or don't, I'm not your boss. I'm from Winchester in England. I had a very happy childhood, went to good schools, came from a loving family, had loving parents, and yet I was always a candidate for alcoholism. It was in me very, very young. On reflection, looking back, it was obvious early. I always drank more than everybody else. I was drinking more often than everybody else. And then even in my teens, I was already starting to drink alone. Over my life, I have traveled a lot, and I lived in China from my mid-20s to my mid-30s. And while I was there, I suffered a minor traumatic brain injury, the result of a cycling accident in Shanghai. And that led to a period of accelerated recklessness and impulsivity, sex, drink, drugs, that kind of thing. Frontal lobe injuries will do that. The most common reported side effect of a frontal lobe injury is increased impulsiveness, poor decision making. And I was already bad at that before the injury. And as I said, My behavior patterns, my drinking patterns had marked me out as having potential for alcoholism even before the head injury. In fact, I was already certainly an alcoholic when the brain injury happened. I was about 32 when that injury occurred, and by then my drinking was already out of control. So I don't blame the head injury for everything that followed. I think it just accelerated it. All it did was it just sped everything up for me. I got all of the behavioral and psychological consequences of extremely heavy drinking, long-term drinking, crammed into about 5 years rather than 25. And incidentally, if you ask me today whether I regret the injury happening, I would say that I wish it had never happened, but I'm also glad that it did. I would tell you that I am grateful that it sped up my catastrophic, suicidal drinking to the point that my alcoholism was too obvious to ignore. Not everybody is that lucky. Some people, well, they're not even aware they have a problem until it is so deeply entrenched that it would take a major, life-changing, destructive event in order to snap them out of it. The treatment I got for the head injury in China was not particularly comprehensive. In fact, here is a photo of me the day of being released from the hospital in Shanghai. And here is a still from a video that I filmed the next day at work. I fractured my skull and then went to work and filmed this video about luxury prostate massages. I don't have time to explain that. The video, I'm covered in makeup, but you wouldn't know from looking at that image that there was something quite subtle but profoundly wrong with me. And I didn't know either until years later. For now, all you need to know for the rest of this story about me is that I had an untreated brain injury. I had a pre-existing alcohol use disorder, getting worse and worse every day. I was genetically predisposed towards alcoholism. And then, in the middle of all of that, I decided it would be a good idea to set off for a solo round-the-world cycling adventure trip, all the way from Shanghai back to Europe via the Northern Silk Road route. Oh, and if you scoffed a moment ago about the prostate massager thing, it was those prostate massagers that paid for that journey, which cost me about 20 grand or so. So I guess, it turns out the wages of sin are actually pretty good. As some of you may know, that journey ended catastrophically, with some jail time, getting deported from Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan, then deported from Azerbaijan back to the UK. And after that period, I spent a bit of time, I relocated to Zagreb in Croatia, where I was briefly sober until eventually, in fact quite quickly, a very public brush with suicidality caused me to return to the UK. So that's me, that's some context. And if this is the first of my videos that you've watched, know that I am genuinely one of the worst, most extreme rock bottom alcoholics you will ever meet, even if I don't really sound like it. And I can assure you that I am impossibly lucky to be alive today, and I do not take that for granted. So, with all that said, all of the foundation laid, let's talk about loneliness. My alcoholism is defined by loneliness, and vice versa. I didn't figure that out until long into sobriety. But for me, at some point in my drinking, the alcohol and the loneliness became inextricable. I was only very briefly a social alcoholic. I was an alienating, isolating alcoholic for most of my drinking career. By the age of 19, I was already a solitary binge drinker. A close the curtains, turn the lights off, turn the phone off, shut the world out, get hammered alone in the dark kind of drinker. Just me, a bottle of vodka, and some brain rot YouTube videos. So, the best way for me to talk about the experience and the intersection of alcohol and loneliness is to describe my experience of it and hope that that connects with somebody out there. I'll begin by describing the period of my life immediately after that bike ride thing, when I rented a fishing cottage in a remote village in Cornwall and drank hard liquor day in and day out in every moment of my wakefulness until it nearly killed me for a period of 6 months. Those 6 months, I barely remember them. I remember fleeting moments of lucidity from that time, but the whole period is remembered through soup. It's all congealed in my mind, and I have difficulty identifying the order of events from that 6 months. I could condense all of my memory, all of my individual memories from that time into about a week's worth of total memory. Time gets squidgy in alcoholism. It's not like dream time. It's more like indistinct time. Since this time I'm about to describe, I've had several periods of relapse where I thought that I had got away with it for 2 or 3 days, only to find out, to be told by a loved one, that I have been missing for 2 weeks and turned up in a psych ward somewhere. That's very destabilizing. In that time, those 6 months, I held down a remote consultancy job and wrote a book, but I don't really remember doing any of that. You know how Stephen King talks about how he doesn't remember writing Cujo at all, despite it being an international bestseller, or how Matthew Perry doesn't remember filming 3 series of Friends because he was constantly drunk. I can understand that. To be blackout drunk and still somewhat productive. Sitting down to prepare for this video, I have notes in front of me. I can't remember a single email that I sent to justify the salary I was being paid. I can't remember writing a page of that book. I have very few memories of that period in which I was sat at my desk in the office that I had built for myself. I don't remember doing anything. Most of my memories from that period are simply of me flopping around in a piss-soaked bed in the dark, with sheets not changed for weeks or even months at a time. And I remember my electricity constantly going out because I just simply didn't pay the bill. Or I remember sitting in the rain at the top of the cliff, crying into a bottle of cheap whiskey while I looked out over the ocean, praying either a stranger would come and save me or just push me in. It was a bleak time, man. A bleak time. 6 months of hard drinking, relentless drinking and nothing else. And the problem is that I had chosen that. I had craved that. That's why I was there, was to do that. I didn't tell anyone that was the reason, but I chose that for myself, to go and be alone and to destroy myself. I cannot make it make sense to you. But if you know, you know. I wanted that. Even as a child, I would dream of being the only person left alive on the planet. Or I would fantasize about being stuck in a supermarket after everybody had left. And I would wander around deserted industrial estates on the weekends when there was no one else there. I was, and still am in fact, very drawn to abandoned buildings, and especially abandoned towns and cities. I've scratched that itch. I have been to the ghost cities in China that you might have seen on the news. I've been to some of them, and I found it satisfying. The bleakness of it appeals. I liked being lost as a kid. And as I got older and grew up, those same places, those deserted buildings around the area in which I grew up, which was kind of a relatively not poor, but certainly not wealthy farming community. There was plenty of those kind of abandoned businesses around. And instead of being places for adventure and exploration, they became places to drink. Even when I didn't need to do it. Even when I rented nice apartments in the city, I would go and seek out these deserted places to drink, or I would get hammered under motorway bridges There's no reason for me to do it, but something in me felt a desire to do it. Then, as my career developed and long-term relationships became part of my experience, I had less and less time to disappear like that and to obliterate myself. But the urge towards it grew. The urge never diminished. In fact, it grew in long-term relationships. As I developed more and more responsibilities, the urge towards self-obliteration in some anonymous place just swelled within me. And it would burst out of me. Every few months, I would be fine for long periods, and then suddenly I would disappear. And I mean that literally. Several times I've been reported as a missing person to the police. And that's why I sought out that remote fishing village in Cornwall at the very height of my alcoholism. It's because I was going there to disappear. So let me set the scene. The village I was in was on a very rugged south coast of Cornwall. It was an active fishing village and had been for centuries. It's not a town, it's just a collection of old fishermen's houses. And that's what I was renting, an ancient fisherman's cottage. And it was a damp and mouldy house, very windy, very poorly insulated, very cold. And the walls would drip with condensation. And the very thin window panes, decades old, were just thick with grime and moss around the rotting window frames. So it was a very beautiful, it was a very pretty house, but very poorly maintained. And I loved it. It was swept by bitterly cold wind straight off the Celtic Sea. And that wind howled down through the valley and smashed against the hills at the back of the town. And at high tide and in stormy conditions, the Celtic Ocean would just roll straight up through the middle of the village, right up to the steps of my local pub. In fact, there were 4 pubs in that town and 2 liquor stores for a village of, 400 people. 4 pubs and 2 off licenses. England has a problem, is what I'm saying. And I was in a very casual sexual relationship with one of the bar staff from that local pub. She was a young Croatian woman. So we had things in common. She'd also lived in China, and I'd lived in China and Croatia. So we really did have stuff to talk about. And I remember that she was always incredibly pleased to see me when I walked in, because in the off-season, when there were no tourists there, I was the only person in the village or in the pub who was not a Cornish fisherman. So I think I appealed I was sexy by default. And she might stop by my house. She had to walk past it after a shift. And she knew that I would be in there, probably drunk and probably horny. And I think it was easier for her than calling a taxi in the middle of the night. And we would talk until we were both drunk enough to have really just uninhibited sex. And then she would leave. And in that way, it was perfect for both of us. Today, I don't even remember her name, to my shame. But I'm pretty confident that she never even knew mine. And that was perfect for me at that time. Deep in loneliness and despair, drenched with alcohol, and occasional casual sex on offer with someone who didn't care that I was so obviously a mess. And that was fine by me. If you'd have asked me when I was 25 what I wanted out of life, I probably would have described a situation exactly like that. But even by the standards of casual sex, it was lonely. And my main preoccupation was not with the sex, but was with the alcohol. And the mutual enabling that we offered each other with regards to the sex and the alcohol. My sole preoccupation was with the constant acquisition and ceaseless consumption of very strong, cheap alcohol in overwhelming quantities. I wanted to obliterate myself. And my pattern for that, for acquiring the alcohol, was that I would go, there were 2 off licenses, and the first day I would go to one of them and buy 3 large bottles of vodka and whiskey. And then on that first day, I would drink all of one bottle and a little less than half of the second bottle, and then black out. And in the morning, I would drink the remainder of the bottle that I had opened the previous night, and then most of, but not all, of the second bottle of that day. And then I would go to the off-license, to the liquor store, to a different liquor store, and do the same, buy 3 more. And in that way, I believed that the shop worker would believe that I was only buying 3 bottles every 4 days, when in fact, I was drinking double that because I was going to 2 shops. I was dividing my efforts. And it's ridiculous to think that that would work and that they wouldn't talk to each other in a village that small. I was not getting away with it. I didn't know that until the end, but they carried on serving me regardless, buying 3 bottles of very strong liquor, vodka or whiskey, and drinking 3 of them over 2 days, and then going to the opposite shop, alternating between them. Plus, I was drinking that amount plus anything I drank in the pub, which was often enough to get most people hammered alone without going back home to drink on my own. And that's only generally. In practice, my drinking was not that structured, not that well organized. And if you've had a period of alcoholism, you probably know that things start to slide pretty quickly. I would only ever eat when my hunger became too intense to ignore. And even then, it was not good. It was not any kind of healthy eating habits. But when that hunger was overwhelming, I would splash water on my face, run a comb through my beard, quickly douse all of the key areas, face, armpits, groin, in the hope of concealing the worst of the stale liquor smell. And I'd put on sunglasses so they couldn't see my glassy eyes, and I would tumble out of my front door like a daywalker, down my garden to the end, where there was often a hot dog stall. And I would buy a hot dog or a burger and retreat back to my disgusting lair, back to my beloved bottle. The woman at that hot dog stand stopped making eye contact with me after 2 months or so. She could see that I was in desperate trouble, and she didn't want to watch it. She didn't want to look at it. And more than anything, I remember how interactions like that one, furtively running to the hot dog stand just so I didn't black out from the hunger, I remember how lonely that felt when she wouldn't look me in the eye. It was not the loneliness that I had wanted. It was a different kind. My personality, even now in sobriety, seeks out loneliness. I am a lonely person. I keep a very small friend group, always have done. And my idea of happiness is not a luxury apartment in some city with a beautiful view, or a Hollywood mansion. I can't think of anything worse. What I want, and what I think, at least secretly, a lot of straight white men like me really want, is a handmade lodge on the side of a mountain in a forest with a view of a lake where we can fish. And a crossbow to shoot deer, and a diesel generator, and a good Starlink internet connection for all the porn that we will inevitably watch, given half the chance. And I kind of had that for a while. I had to be self-sufficient to a degree in that village. But it was not fun, and it was not romantic, or poetic, or glamorous, like I'd hoped it would be. It was only suffering. And it was suffering without any of the positive byproducts that sometimes are associated with suffering. There was no resilience associated with it, no gratitude, no learning oneself. It was just suffering, unfiltered and distilled. I learned that my desire to be alone wasn't because I hated everyone around me. I didn't hate the world. That was never true. The truth was that I hated myself, and I felt like I didn't deserve to be around other people. I didn't deserve to be accepted by other people. It wasn't coming from a place of rejection of the wider world. It was coming from a place of very low self-worth. And I was always grateful, as much as I yearned for connection in that loneliness. I was always grateful when the Croatian girl left, or when the person knocking at my door to check on my well-being gave up and walked away. I would crawl back to my dirty bed, surrounded by empty Haribo packets and hot dog wrappers, and neck the vodka straight from the bottle. I wanted the connection, but I also rejected it. And the loneliness I craved ultimately turned inwards. By the end of that period, it wasn't really about loneliness anymore. It was about suicide. I was trying, really trying, to drink myself to death there. I wanted to die alone. There's no ambiguity about that. That's what it was. My years of alcoholism were really just one very long and very cowardly suicide attempt. I remember in the warmer months, there was a little village craft fair outside my house at the end of my garden. One of the stalls was operated by a young illustrator. She painted like ink paintings of cats staring up at the night sky. And the first time I spoke to her, I was relatively sober, and I think I must have been relatively charming. And we talked at length about our favourite illustrators, and we had in common a favourite illustrator, a Spanish woman called Kira Bautista. And I think I must have left a good impression that time. And I felt like I had made a connection, and it was thrilling, and I thought about her for quite a while afterwards, and I looked forward to her coming back. And I was so nervous about a connection puncturing through my loneliness that the next time she was back, I had drunk heavily before I went to go and talk to her. I'm not a young man at this point, I should stress. I was 35. So it wasn't necessary for me to be drinking heavily to go and speak to a woman. It's very unlike me. So that second time I went back and I was hammered when I spoke to her. And I remember crying at her stall. Like so overwhelmed with emotion, so desperate to be liked, so desperate to force a connection to happen that I was overwhelmed with drunken emotion and burst into tears. And I remember a look of supreme discomfort, not sympathy, but pity. And after that, I hated that fair. And I used to watch it through the curtains, full of resentment, peeking like an old spy with a half-empty bottle of vodka in my hand. And by that time, I was not just lonely, but openly resentful of people who were not lonely. Why do they deserve to be happy and I don't? That desire to be isolated, and not just be isolated, but to reject the world, is, I think, a prominent pattern of people in recovery, especially, not everyone, but especially people like me, people whose drinking patterns are like mine. We want to feel bad. We want a reason to feel bad. We make ourselves lonely. I had chosen that fishing village for that reason, to make myself lonely. To be lonely, and it was successful. It was so successful to the point that I was utterly miserable about it. That's how successful it was. I was suicidal. In the end, I left that village, and not really of my own choosing. I was kind of gently forced, let's put it that way. And nothing as grand or as obvious as an intervention. But it was an intervention. I had money. I'd still been taking a salary the whole time I was working there. Not a bad one either. But I hadn't been paying the rent. I just didn't. I didn't want to deal with anything like that. I didn't want to face any kind of responsibility. I never opened my mail. My electricity, as I mentioned, kept being cut off, not because I didn't have the money. I could pay. I just didn't. When the power was cut off, I would just flop in my bed in the dark and drink. No music, no YouTube, because all of my electronics would die. I would just lie on the bed in the dark and tell myself I would deal with my problems in the morning. But when the morning rolled around, the first business of the day was always the bottle. And after that first swig, nothing's getting done. If you're anything like me, the tendency towards alienation and isolation and loneliness is a very dangerous one. We, people like me, we yearn to be alone, and then we resent our loneliness. And then we drink more to escape the isolation and the low self-worth. And that drives people increasingly away. And then we blame them for it. Or we decide that we must be, since everybody has left us, we must be so disgusting as to not be worthy of love. So we drink more, just to blot out that thought for a while. That period of my life ended in several hospitals and psych wards and experiences with delirium tremens, major hallucinations, and close calls with death. And even that didn't stop it. After I left that village, I was still lonely for a long time. And it would take, I don't know, even after all that, it still took, 2 years before I took sobriety seriously. It doesn't go away straight away. Loneliness is a very hard problem to tackle. It's not as easy as just going out and making friends, because we are of the personality type that is resisting that to start with. We know when we reach for that first drink how bad it's going to be. We know what the consequences are, but it doesn't matter to us. It makes no difference. And I don't know what comes first for me, the loneliness or the alcohol, but I know that together they are more than the sum of their parts. I never fully recovered from that social isolation, and I never was able to rebuild all of the bridges that I burned. And to this day, as a result of that period, I have a very small but good friend group. And I've had to learn to be okay with that. But I don't hate myself anymore. And that means that I don't seek out the same kind of self-obliteration in deliberate isolation. I turned a corner on that. I still have bad habits and dangerous behaviors, but I can pretty safely assure you I will never cry at a craft fair ever again. And now that I've tasted the kind of loneliness that I thought I craved, I have to be more careful what I wish for. So, if you're lonely today, and you've watched this far into a video this depressing, then say hello to me, reach out to me. My email address, as always, is in the video description. I don't have all of the answers clearly to all of the problems, but I do try to make as much time as possible to at least give a reply, because I know what it's like. Thank you for watching, and as always, good luck out there.